Guys, welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Liu Xin. Now, in this series, we take a look at stories making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join us in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN webpage on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN app, email us at thepoint with alex@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. Now, we start our live streaming, as many of you know, every Friday at 11 a.m. Beijing time. Get in touch, and we just might read out your comments. Before we get to today's topic, some comments we've received so far from our viewers like you via social media. YouTube user Jay Cobham says, China hates the US, always have, always will. There's no need for any further dealing with each other. Time is for total separation. Wow. No shared values or goals, so there is no future for the relationship between the US and China. Separation or war, there's no longer any other possibilities. Now, YouTube user Edgar says this, the US media always know when to choose sides and who to side with, and they do it with subtlety and aplomb like no other media around the world. The US media can always be counted on to do the US government's bidding. Now, Twitter user AlexSpring17 says, we both know it's all about the election. If Trump really cares about national security, he would have done something in the early days of his administration. Personally, I think that China card is more or less the only card he has to play. We really appreciate all your comments. Keep them coming, please. This week, we are looking at media coverage on the delay of Hong Kong's 7th term Legislative Council, also known as LegCo, originally scheduled for September 6th. Now, it's delayed by a year due to a surge in COVID-19 cases in the city. Now, on Tuesday, China's top legislature voted to adopt a decision for the 6th LegCo of the Hong Kong SAR to continue performing its duties. The decision was made after Chief Executive of the Hong Kong SAR, Carrie submitted a report to the Central People's Government on July 28th on matters concerning the postponement and asked the central government in Beijing to request the NPC Standing Committee to make arrangements handling the vacancy of the LegCo incurred due to the postponement. The postponement comes a day after Hong Kong authorities disqualified 12 candidates from the upcoming elections on the grounds that they were not fit to run for office. The decision was made in line with Hong Kong's mini-constitution, the Basic Law, according to the statement. Now, the developments have been met with controversy, of course. The Five Eyes Alliance, for example, released a joint statement on the topic on August 9th that says, we, the foreign ministers of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, and the United States Secretary of State are gravely concerned by the Hong Kong government's unjust disqualification of candidates and disproportionate postponement of Legislative Council elections. These moves have undermined the democratic process that has been fundamental to Hong Kong's stability and prosperity, unquote. That is, of course, the statement from Five Eyes Alliance. With everything else going on in Hong Kong, sanctions, high-profile arrests under the region's new national security law, it is, of course, easy for some critics, however, to accuse the government of Hong Kong of using the pandemic as an excuse to keep people from voting in the midst of a politically sensitive time. But here's another way to look at it. Hong Kong is currently battling what's being called the third wave of COVID-19 infections, with a total of 4,243 cases reported as of August 12th. On Wednesday alone, 62 new infections were confirmed, marking the 10th straight day of double-digit increase to its total, after a 12-day run of triple-digit surges. So far, over 60 people have unfortunately and tragically died. Now, the number of cases is low compared to some other places, yes, but the spike has raised fresh concerns, and the leadership in Hong Kong is doing what they can to contain the virus. For example, at the request of Hong Kong SAR government, the first batch of mainland professionals already arrived in Hong Kong in early August to join the anti-pandemic fight. In addition to that, 5 million people are expected to take part in a massive voluntary coronavirus testing program, according to the city's health minister. Last but not least, a 500-bed temporary hospital has been set up mainly to treat COVID-19 patients with mild symptoms or those still waiting to be admitted to hospital. From the very beginning, in fact, Hong Kong has taken the virus seriously. Now, This is interesting. In early February, the Hong Kong SAR government took measures to curb the inflow of travelers from the mainland by closing several border checkpoints, suspending ferry and cross-border train services, and reducing flights later on. More stringent measures, including social distancing and quarantine, were also introduced and carried out. Now, postponing the election of LegCo, Hong Kong's legislature, has been another such move. Regarding the decision, Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie has said she would invoke emergency powers to postpone the elections. Let's listen to what she said.
Now,
the Legislative Council General Election is held once every 4 years. It is a really tough decision to delay it, but then we want to ensure fairness, we want to ensure public safety and health, and also we need to make sure that the elections are held in an open, fair and impartial manner. So this decision is therefore essential.
Of course, this is a big decision, a decision not without its controversy. And the point of today's discussion is how are the news media globally covering the decision? Let's first take a look at this Guardian report with a headline from July 31st that reads, "Concern as Hong Kong postpones elections for a year, citing COVID-19. And the decision is an assault on fundamental freedoms," says Hong Kong Watch. As democracy deteriorates. As you can see, a critical opinion was quoted up front, setting the tone for the whole report. The opening paragraph starts off by saying this: "The Hong Kong government has postponed its upcoming elections for 1 year, citing the growing coronavirus outbreak in the territory, but sparking immediate accusations that the pandemic was being used as a pretext to suppress democracy." Carrie Lam's opinion was quoted where she said she, quote, had invoked colonial-era emergency regulations to delay the September 6th vote to September 5th, 2021. That is a year from now, saying it was the hardest decision she's ever made in the past 7 months, but had the full support of the Chinese central government. Now, when the article describes Lam's response to accusations that the delay had been labeled as an assault on fundamental freedoms, it says, in an increasingly defensive tone, Lam told the press conference there was definitely no political consideration to decision, and which had nothing to do with the likely outcome of this round of elections, referring to speculation that pro-democracy parties would win a majority. And then it gets interesting. The article goes on to pack the piece with comments from people with the same opinion. It quotes analysts from NGOs based in London and New York, but some commentators point out that the article would have been more convincing if it has talked to people who are actually from or live or vote in Hong Kong. The article does quote the high-profile activist, Joshua Wong, who was disqualified from running in the LegCo election. Rather than talk to a public health expert or an actual voter in Hong Kong, the article goes on to quote Chris Patten, the last British governor of Hong Kong, who says, quote, "The national security law is being used to disenfranchise the majority of Hong Kong citizens." As you can read, it is obviously now illegal to believe in democracy, although this was what Beijing promised in and after the joint declaration. This is the sort of behavior that you would expect in a police state, unquote. It is interesting to hear Lord Patten lecture the world on democracy and disenfranchisement, given the fact that he was never elected to his post as governor of Hong Kong by anyone, but rather appointed by the British monarch back when Hong Kong was one of the monarch's colonies. Now, let's not forget that these governors sent from the UK were historically made president of the LegCo and appointed most, if not all, of the members of the colony's legislature. Now, our next example comes from the Washington Post on July 31st. The headline says, "Hong Kong leader postpones elections, further eroding political freedoms." Well, reading the headline, it is hard not to think that the verdict is already in. And there's no mention of the public health concerns linked to the delay. The opening paragraph said this, quote, "The Hong Kong government said on Friday it would delay Legislative Council elections for a year because of the coronavirus pandemic, undermining one of the few partially democratic institutions left in the Chinese territory as Beijing tightens its grip," unquote. But this article did not mention the surge of new cases over the past month or the strict measures Hong Kong has been taking since the beginning of its outbreak to prevent the spread of the virus. Later on in the article, it mentions Hong Kong's third wave, but only in the context that epidemiologists have said the daily cases will likely drop in about 4 to 6 weeks, which seems to suggest that Carrie Lam's decision cannot be justified. He also argues that in the absence of September election, now Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie Lam said the makeup of the 70-seat council will be decided by Beijing until new elections are held. Well, the only thing is, as the article itself says, only half of the 70 seats in Hong Kong's Legislative Council are directly elected. So it's not as if Beijing would reshuffle the entire council, as this sentence makes it sound. Regardless, there has been an update on the issue. China's top legislature on Wednesday announced that after September 30th, the 6th LegCo will continue performing duties for no less than a year until the 7th LegCo starts its four-year term. So the current council will stay put until the next election. Now, we see a familiar pattern here when it comes to the opinion portion of the article. Again, Joshua Wong, the same NGO spokespeople were quoted, and on top of that, the White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. It is a complicated issue for sure. Public health and politics, the ongoing entanglement. A scholar quoted in the recent BBC article sums up the paradox pretty well. Eugene Tan, a law professor and political commentator at Singapore Management University, said that if you delay elections, you could be accused of waiting for a more favorable time for the government. But if you go ahead, you could be accused of playing fast and loose with people's lives. The worst thing would be to have an election and then have a spike in the number of cases, unquote. It's important for people to get clear ideas of the issue from both sides. With that,